All right, welcome back to Over-Engineered, the podcast where we ask the question, what's the absolute best way to do things we already have a perfectly acceptable solution for? Today, we are trying video, so you may be seeing this on video, or we may have abandoned it and just post the audio. We'll see. But I am back with Skyler Katz and Bogdan Kharchenko. You guys want to say hi?
Hello, hello. Nice to see everybody out there in podcast land.
Hello, everybody. Great to be back. It's been a while. I feel like Chris has been going off on his own and doing his own podcast show with everybody, all the cool people. So it's exciting to be back here.
You guys are the OGs, though, you know? So the three of us work together, and this question came up recently that it was kind of a specific problem that maybe we'll get into later, but the general question of how much should a blade component do? Like, what's the scope of a blade component? Because we kind of got into a situation where there was a component that was doing a lot in its should render method, and it just it sparked quite a heated discussion, and so we thought it might be just kind of interesting to think about, like, what are the boundaries of a blade component? It's not exactly the classic over engineering problem, but it's more just I mean, I think we can find a way to over engineer it. So I don't know, Skylar, do you want to kind of like talk about the initial thing, the initial problem that you were solving, and what felt good about that approach?
Yeah, so we have this email that we need to send to our members, our users in our app, and some of the parts of the message, it depended on which state that you reside in as to whether or not you receive something. In some states, you receive it all the time. In other states, you only receive it during certain days of the year. And in my first pass, I had all these if statements just in the email blade view. Like if user state is California and they are in this state of app, like they scored a certain way on an exam, then display this additional include. And I finished, and the blade view was very large and it looked gross to me. But then I discovered a should render method is available in the blade component. And so I moved a bunch of logic. I split out all of these California, North Carolina, like all these various localities, and did SQL queries in their should render method as to whether or not the user is in the right state, and submit the PR. And I was like, oh, this is perfect. Like it looks so much better. I could test these blade components. And then Chris reviewed the PR and was like, I don't know about this. Maybe we should do if statements. And so it entailed just this long conversation. And, boss man Chris is the boss. So PR got closed, but it was good. I feel like we came to a good solution in the end, but yeah, I still am on team should render.
Yeah, I mean, spoiler alert, if you go back to the episode with Caleb, the whole hooks implementation ended up being the solution here, or we're hopeful. When Caleb and I were talking about it, we were mostly talking about like hooking into moments that a class or function is executing, but the same sort of principle sort of translates really nicely to view rendering as well. And so there's a early pre-release of the hooks package that you can check out that does both sort of the breakpoint hooks that we were talking about in the last episode, as well as like providing a way to hook into moments in a view render if you need to do a lot of like really complicated logic. But the question sort of still remains, because like when I was reviewing the PR, like the end result is you've got this email view that just has a couple of blade components at the top of it that, from my perspective, I'm just like, well, it's just always showing this like California notice and this Nevada, or I can't remember what the other one was, but and it's always showing these notices. That's kind of weird. And nothing was getting passed into them. So it's like, how is it like, what is going on here? And so I think like my first reaction was just like, what is going on? And this feels really bad. And maybe we should just have if statements because that would be more clear. But I have been in the exact same place of like the moment you start having a bunch of if statements in a blade component, it just gets it, it it gets really rough. If you need to do really conditional rendering, but it's something that has a lot of shared language or shared UI, it's like you're in that in between place. It's just a hard thing to solve. And so I totally get like using that should render logic and letting blade components be sort of more self-aware. Like I think it is a cool idea and it definitely potentially solves a problem, but I think it feels a little bit like, is it too off the beaten path or something like that? I don't know.
So is your kind of like concern with, just the data being like loaded from the database, let's say from that component, and there's like nothing getting passed in, or the fact that the component itself is like dictating whether or not it should render? Under the hood, should render is being called all the time when the components boil down into like PHP code, when the view is cached. So, if you just return false in there, it gets evaluated anyway. You're not adding anything on top. Obviously, the downside is, the entire component gets, parsed into, you know, PHP code. So is that kind of like the question? Like, you don't want that code being computed, or the fact that there's no data being passed into that component, and that component is loading its own data, which could potentially, you know, introduce N+1 issues and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's more the latter. I think that there are kind of two things happening here. One is like anytime you introduce sort of like a non idiomatic approach to things, like it just introduces like friction, or it introduces just like a little bump when you're looking at the code, when you're reading the code, right? So like I think there's that question. Is it is it common enough to have blade components that are just like may not do anything and you just have to know that? Like and I think that's the type of thing, just like I always talk about this with event driven applications versus like any other approach. Like there's nothing wrong with firing a ton of events and then reacting to those events, but that needs to be sort of the primary interface that your application uses to communicate, or else you're just not going to think to look in event listeners or observers or whatever, because unless that's where you always go to look, I think it's hard to think, okay, well, this isn't what I'm trying to find isn't in the code, but like, oh, maybe it's in an event listener somewhere, right? And that bites us. I mean, that's bitten us plenty of times for the few places that we do have event listeners. It's like sometimes we don't think to look there until it's until we're a little frustrated. So I think that like the one side of it, I feel like you could just decide as a team, like we're going to lean really into this like approach to blade components and say, you know, you may see a stack of 10 blade components on top of each other, and you just know like not necessarily all 10 of those are going to render. It's just like any combination of these 10 things may render for the current circumstances. And I think that would probably be fine. Like if that was kind of just like the approach that your app took and it was normal, it still would probably be a little weird for, a new developer to come to, but that's probably fine. We learn things quickly. I think the thing that like I have an immediate hell no reaction to is when you start doing eloquent queries in the view, when you start doing eloquent queries in the blade component, because it's like it's just not obvious that that's happening. And yeah, I think you're really likely to introduce some weird performance issues, whether it's an N+1 or something else, or just not not be aware of what's happening inside the application. But even there, I'm open to being convinced, because I think it's easy to fall down that hole of like, well, this isn't appropriate for, like, this is not the proper place to do this thing, so you should never do it here. And it's like sometimes it's way better to do it that way. So like I'm
Yeah, I
willing
mean,
to be convinced.
I'll say, like, in this example of a mailable, originally, all of these queries, like, "Is California?" was a Boolean that I was having to calculate in the mailable and then pass to the view. And then in the view, I was just like, "If is California," and then it was like, "If is North Carolina, and is North Carolina display time." And, like, these were then just, there were maybe 20 variables that I was having to just pass into the view,
Yeah.
and the mailable got really unwieldy. You're like, "Why we have to calculate all these queries, but now we're doing them all up here." Instead, it was like, "Oh, the California in component," and it passed in the user, and then it was like, "Oh, here's the query for should render," and it's all contained. I don't
Yeah.
know. It those queries have to happen somewhere. It's not like the queries don't exist. If
Right.
anything, it's like more encapsulated. You're like, "All right, well, I'm in the California component, and now I'm doing the calculation for California."
Yeah, what do you think, Bogdan? Should components ever make eloquent queries?
I mean, it depends. I think like a good example that I can quickly think of is, say you have a component in your dashboard called like friend list, and it's just like a div, and it renders only if you have friends, and if you don't have friends, it renders maybe there's another thing that it would render, and you could basically wrap that component in an if statement in your parent like Blade template, or you can have the should render function basically decide on its own. It's like, hey, if there's a list of friends that were passed into this component, should I render myself? And that would render potentially other components like child components. So I think that could be like a pretty compelling reason for me to say like, all right, well, if the data is passed in, and I can decide whether or not I'm going to render myself. I think that's like a pretty decent pattern. As far as actually making eloquent queries, I've been in a situation before where I would have a Blade component, say it was like a select to component, that's like the auto tag complete, and all I wanted to do is just say like, well, if you pass me a bunch of IDs, I'm going to go into my tags table and load a bunch of those IDs from the database fresh. And I know that that component itself is never going to be, oh, I can't say never, but likely only be rendered once or twice per page. So I'm willing to
Right.
accept that, because otherwise you would have to like pass that data from a controller, for example, and somehow hydrate those fields. It gets a little bit messy as well. So I think there's a trade-off. I think even to this example that Skyler has been mentioning, I keep kind of going back to this idea. Well, how do we get here, right? Like, how do we get to if is this California, if this is that? Perhaps there's a missing piece of like a database table that kind of dictates what is being shown in some of these messages in the mailable. And then maybe you wouldn't have to do all of this gymnastics inside of the component or somewhere else. So that's kind of where I stand.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what makes this when we get into the specifics, it gets complicated, because the reality is, Skylar's kind of even simplifying the situation. Like, when you deal with hundreds of licensing bodies that each have potentially dozens of rules about certain ways you message people, or certain notices that you can or can't show, or blackout dates, or all these, it just, I can imagine, I can hear someone listening to this being like, well, that sounds like really bad architecture, and the reality is, you just have to trust us that this is really complicated and it needs a necessarily somewhat complicated solution. Like there is no way to make 500 times 12 times every possible like decision point number of options like easy to manage. And so no matter what, this was going to be something that was going to be a little tricky. But it is funny, like when you talk about that like autocomplete like select two thing. I don't know exactly what it is, but for me, I'm like, well, I can live with that doing a database query. Like I could because I can imagine that it might, like when you look at that thing and like it's like an X select two and you pass it a property called IDs or whatever, like it just feels like it's kind of implied that there's going to be something happening in the background like that handles it for you. And I think maybe that's what it is like I don't think that I'm like hardline never do any eloquent queries in a blade component. Nor am I hardline like never you should never use should render, because I think should render or just like an if statement inside your blade component is perfectly fine if it's like yeah, I'm dropping the friends list right here. If they don't have friends, just nothing's going to show. And if they do, it'll render the friends list. Like that feels perfectly fine to me. And like I can also see like if I saw in the code like X friends list user equals user, right? Like you pass in the user and you're rendering a friends list component. Like I would just assume that component is going to load a missing friends relationship if it's not already loaded. And like it's going to be aware of the database to some degree. And that feels fine to me too. So it's like I've already accepted that I'm not opposed to any of these things, but for some reason, still like thinking back to looking at that code, I'm just like something about it felt wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I think too though, like, you know, let's say your friends list component, and so in your view, you're like at if user friends count or is not empty on the collection, then here's the component. But then and this may be in multiple places in your application. And then, now you want to change how you're determining if they have friends. Maybe you want to show potential friends if they're new. Now you've got to go to all the places where you had the if statement as opposed to like, just open up the friends component and recalculate in the should render, and you're good to go. You've just finished the feature, right away. And this is a little thing, but when I'm writing a blade, you got your HTML, and now you've got this if statement, and then you're indenting, deeper in, and like in an email, every time you indent in, it's like gonna do weird stuff in Outlook, which a lot of our users use. And so kind of nice to be able to just keep the indentation nice and let the component decide, should we render? I mean, that's a little thing, but
I
it's still
have no
there.
qualms with pointing out the aesthetics for sure. You didn't even have to make the Outlook argument for me to be convinced on that point. Yeah, no, I mean, well, okay. There's two different things going on here, right? I can find like a supporting argument and a counter argument, and I can't figure out which one is right, because it's like it's a question of like coupling versus collocation, kind of, right? Like because that same argument that you just made could be true of a a CSS, like an old school BEM style CSS component, right? Where you're like, well, I have this like card component and card header component, or card class and card header class and card body class or whatever. And if I ever want to change the way cards look, I just go and update the card class and it updates across the entire site. And the end result is you have to create a card2 class because you don't know what you're going to break when you change the card class. So you're always afraid to change anything because of that exact, the thing that we thought was a power is actually like, a huge liability. And that's why Tailwind became so popular, or that's a reason why Tailwind became so popular. So like that, it feels a little bit like that of like, okay, well now if this logic lives inside my component, I have to think like, if I go change this for this one page, do I want that to cascade across all the other pages that use this component? But on the flip side, I think you're absolutely right that like finding ways to sort of put all the stuff that belongs together. This, I think there's we've talked about this before, like this appreciation in 2023, 2024 of like co-locating code. Yeah, there is a really compelling argument to say like, instead of having to do all this stuff in your controller or in some sort of helper object that you pass through the controller to the view to the blade component, like the blade component is just nice encapsulated, responsible for the whole decision and all the data that it needs. And like you can just delete that whole component if you ever don't need it anymore. And like you don't have to like walk up the chain of all the calls. Like that's really compelling too, right? It's kind of like, which one of these two things is it, or is it both? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, I will say like one, I think, we shouldn't be nailing screws, because that's the wrong tool for the job, and vice versa. Like you have to kind of make a decision of what's appropriate. I mean, obviously, having components has been like a huge game changer. Like I've refactored like huge if statements that did like less than, greater than this date, and very complex logic that I didn't understand until like name methods that live inside collocated in the component class. And even if I have to do this additional SQL query or just pass data into it, I don't know, it's just improved my, I don't know, coding ability. And you know uh, co-locating code in general has been fantastic. And the way I look at it, those if statements are really related to a view, and maybe some of those if statements come from like various models, but they're really specific for this component, how they operate. So even if those like logical functions lived in another helper, like it's still, I don't know how likely you would reuse those same thing where you like, yeah, show 5 friends only. That's really specific for this component. It's not really a application wide thing. So I don't know, I really think that you have to sometimes just do one thing or the other. I don't think it's a hard no in any way on either way.
Yeah, I mean that this we have to ignore the fact we wouldn't be allowed to have a podcast if we accepted the fact that the answer is it always depends, though.
I mean, I think too, like there's the potential testability of like you've got this complex logic of if something can show, and so you have a PHP unit test that has a data provider of a bunch of different things that are going to return true or false, and you can test by just newing up the component class and calling should render and determining if all of those different scenarios are true, instead of having to like, let me create a couple of different users and then like call this get and assert that HTML doesn't have a certain thing in it.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean I think, yeah, that is compelling too.
I'm not
I
I'm
think
not
that
sure that
there's
you should do a thing because you can test it differently, but
sure.
but it
It's
is
another tick on the one
it is another
side.
tick.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean I think that for me it's a little bit of like how close to intuitive can this be, right? And I think like, back to what Bogdan said, it depends obviously. And it's like I think that maybe the solution is kind of both. Like maybe you pass in things that feel appropriate to pass in, but let the component do things that feel appropriate for the component to do. And like maybe it's just finding a little bit of a different balance where, where you're like, you're making it so that the call at least gives some hint about the fact that it's like conditional, or yeah, or you're commenting above the block of components being like, the reason why there's 15 stacked components here is because only 4 of them are ever going to render for any given scenario or something like that. I guess that would be fine too. But yeah, it's still, I don't know. I'm still
I,
not
s-
satisfied.
I suppose it really depends on kind of like how you decide to structure your application. I don't think it's just bad idea to just say like, well, this is like the login drop down component, and then there's also like the log out drop out component. And typically you would just say like, well, if user is authenticated, or if auth, show this thing, and you would just do like some sort of partial include, or else do this other thing. I mean, if you decide that you don't like that pattern in your Blade components and you're like, well, I'm just going to have a login drop menu and a logout drop menu, or whatever that is. And those menus themselves, like the logout drop menu, can determine whether or not you're logged in, show different submenus, or whatever the case may be. And they're just stacked on top. Like, I think that's perfectly fine in my book. Like, there's an if statement happening either way,
Right.
and ultimately the stuff gets boiled down into a cached view. So I don't think there's that much of a performance hit.
Right. I don't think there's really a performance implication either way, cuz like you said, the logic has to be executed wherever it gets executed. And I mean, I think that's another big piece of like in our specific scenario, the other issue is like, is this logic only going to be executed here, or are you going to end up like duplicating this? Because, in that scenario, it's like, well, North Carolina has these special dates when you're not allowed to take continuing education exams, right? And that's going to affect the messaging in this email, but it's also going to affect 15 other places in the app. And so I think that's probably another consideration is like, is the logic that you're executing in your component really, really view specific, or is it something else? Because that would be another hint at which pattern you're going to reach for. Because like that was certainly another reason why we decided to kind of like go down another path, is like we knew all of that logic that we were using in that mailable was eventually going to be uh, needed to be extracted out anyway for a bunch of other conditionals. And so like, yeah, it does feel like there's like one element of like you just have to decide, is this a style of code that you like or that your team wants to embrace? And then it is really just like you have to use your best judgment on how how autonomous these components really should be.
The only thing I was gonna say, thinking about like a real solution to this issue that Skylar and we all been dealing with or contemplating on how to do, is like, what if we actually had like a helper function that went state by state and like returned the views like computed effectively, and all you would have to do is just like loop through this collection object and just display this stuff. And that way all you're passing down is like this collection of like pre-computed component, not component, but just like the text that needs to show, and it could be a list of components that do various functions. But ultimately you're just passing one collection saying, hey, for each one of these things there's just like a list of messages and warnings or whatever that are shown. And all of a sudden, you're passing one item in, it's co-located in somewhere else in some sort of helper function, and you can reuse that somewhere else to get those messages into your email, into your web page, or wherever it is.
Yeah, I mean, I think that solves the messy if statement problem. Like I can see
Mm-hmm.
Another place where we have this is like, depending on about 5 or 6 different like nested levels of factors, your billing page is going to display differently, like depending on what kind of plan you're on and what kind of membership you have. And are you paying by credit card online or paying by check and invoice, or like all these different scenarios contribute to what messaging you're going to see and what components you're going to see. And that's like a huge tangled mess of if statements that like felt like, I honestly still feel like it's pretty much the best the best we could do with like the complexity that we were trying to deal with. But I could see an argument for like, yeah, pulling that out into a single class that effectively just, does a bunch of sort of nested loops and builds up, HTML string that you just wrap in that you just pass down as HTML. And I don't know that that would end up being better, but I think it's kind of a cool approach when you have this sort of like lots of conditional logic that you need to like use for specifically for the view, because I think that's where it feels really bad. Like in other places you can there are a lot of more well-established patterns for like cleaning up the complex conditionals, but at the view layer, I just don't think there's the like canonical way to do that. At least in my mind, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, with that billing scenarios, I was just looking. We have 21 different states that a user could be in when it comes to billing and what plan we're supposed to show and who has it. And like the level of abstraction was we just created all these different scenario queries and passed in things. But yeah, the if statements, like they felt gross to me when I was working on that feature too. And
Yeah.
I think had I realized there was a should render, I might have utilized it then. But man, that test is gnarly because we're texting that specific HTML strings are showing up or not showing up
Yeah.
on the page.
Is the challenge with that just the fact that the if statements are like hard to parse, like as you're going down? Is that kind of where it is where you see like a benefit of extracting those conditionals into like a method on the component that would like help decipher what that if statement is doing? Is that part of the situation, or just kind of like um, the children of like all the states that this thing could be, that it could just render different items? I don't know if that makes sense.
I mean, I it's tricky because on one hand, the reality is it's just it's a tree with a lot of branches. And like it just is complex. What did you say? 26 different
21
different
different
21 different scenarios.
scenarios.
And those scenarios are like there's a few like top level conditions, and then each of those top level conditions have a few sub conditions depending on like various pieces. And so like it is, part of the problem again is just like this is a thing that was really complicated. But if I step back, if this were in just like a class and I had all of this nested logic, I would just start extracting it out into named functions. And even if the nesting was, still visually a little bit intense, at least it would just be like, I can read each function name and see, okay, this branch is about like people with lifetime billing who do have billing history. And this branch is about people who are like, who have never paid, but like, whatever the scenarios are, being able to extract things out into functions ends up, you know, becoming a way to label that branch of the logic. And you can do that with partials or blade components, but it's not exactly the same because that is its own entire sort of isolated space, you know? Whereas when you're just extracting parts out into functions, you just have a little more flexibility, I think. I don't know. Maybe the solution here is that we just want, you know, a blade component would be a better approach, and using should render would have helped there. But it's the same. I don't know.
Yeah, it's hard to say
It's
because a lot of these were
tricky.
like, if like I'm looking at the top level view, and you're like, if you have an active subscription and you're not a non-billable user and you're not on a team plan, then display an include. But then the next block says, if you're not a not billable user and you're not on a team plan, display some management options. So like we wouldn't want to recalculate over and over again whether or not
Right.
someone is a billable user. So some of these queries, and it might be hard to realize that that query is being used in multiple places if you don't have it in the controller or the mailable, but you're doing
Yeah.
it individually. You do lose some impact of like what is this, what it data is already available.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you could argue that you can just like do that as like a performance review, right? Where just like maybe you're not going to worry too much about making sure that everything is perfect in the way you're loading your data for like a feature that just isn't very actively used. And then like if it becomes more actively used, you pay a little bit closer attention to the querying and the data fetching and all that stuff. Like it could be the same here, but yeah, the question is like, do you feel like extracting that logic into sort of like some object that you just like pass that object down and then just render it and it's responsible for figuring all this stuff out? Like would that feel better, do you think, or would it just kind of be like moving the problem to somewhere else?
Like an object, like a separate class, or like a component object
Well,
class?
well, I was thinking kind of I was trying to explore the idea that you had of like what if there was just this collection
Sure.
that you could just iterate over and it just decides what pieces to render kind of internally. And I'm just wondering, is that the type of thing that you could reach for to solve these complex
I mean,
cases?
you can certainly do it like right now because I just pulled this code up because I want to see what was going on. Right now, we're just assuming that this code just renders on this blade view, but we could potentially send it as an email. We can potentially show it as like a pop up on somebody's dashboard. There's different mechanisms to push this data. So yes, if we were faced in that position, we would have to extract it effectively and recompute this in various places, and it wouldn't be a component. It would have to be like a standalone object that just renders text. Maybe you want to send them a Slack message or whatever the scenario is. So I think like for this scenario, it could be converted into a view component. But if we, like I said, if we decide to expand the scope of where it's shown, the view component is not going to cut it either. It will have to be like a helper class
Right.
with something. So I like, again, it really depends on what that scenario is.
I
Yeah,
don't
I
know. I
mean,
mean,
oh, go ahead.
well, I was going to say like I was working on a feature, we're working on migrating to Stripe, and with like we want to get admins want to get an email when some Stripe webhooks come in that we're unsure of like what to do in the system. And so we have just this base email that gets sent, like this event happened to this user. But then there were a handful where like, well, their subscription was updated. And so we wanted to know what was changed. And so now we have this class that's like checking to see if the event has some custom views that it should display. And we generate those custom views and then pass them to the main view. And it it's sort of kind of gross to do. I think it's what we are doing here maybe, but the code's not in production yet, so doesn't doesn't
Doesn't
matter.
matter
Like we
yet.
can change it, but sort of this other class somewhere else determining what is going to render in the view also obfuscates, and it could just be a naming problem, like custom views as a variable name just kind of sucks. So
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that there are places where this, like, this is kind of coming to the idea of inversion of control, right? Like, you give, you have a feature that needs to just sort of like open up and let someone else be responsible for like some part of it, right? It's like, I know that I'm not the best one to answer this question, so I'm just going to provide a way for someone else to answer this question, right? And I think that can be a really powerful concept, but it definitely, yeah, it can also be, it's like a layer of abstraction for sure. And that's kind of, I mean, that's the trade-off that we're picking with the hooks, right? That essentially we are introducing this new layer of abstraction that is a little less direct. And I think the trade-off is good in that case, but it's kind of the same thing as this custom view. It's like, I know that every once in a while you might want to render a little bit more than the default view, and rather than have like a bunch of like bespoke mailables for these scenarios that are almost entirely the same except for one little difference, like, we're just going to give you a place to throw a little bit of content. And I think thinking back on that particular feature, the reality is probably just we should just have a customer updated profile mail and then the problem goes away. But it's a solution that is certainly appropriate in places. And yeah, that's kind of what we're getting at here is just like, we know this email may need some specific messaging in certain spots, depending on all sorts of different scenarios. How do we do it?
I mean, so I don't know if you wanted to get into hooks, but I know that when you and Skylar were kind of working on it, I didn't have a chance to really dive deep into it. Perhaps you can give me like a 30-second elevator pitch, um, refresh my mind on how it actually would work.
Skylar, do you want to? I'm curious. Do you want to try to pitch it? Because
I mean,
I'm curious
my
if
like
I have.
snarky, yeah, my snarky response would be like, I think that hooks is why WordPress became the most popular platform to build websites with and power the internet, and because it allowed plugin developers to just access hooks into the life cycle of a request on WordPress and make things, you know, make things hook into WordPress's core as the website was rendering. That's not really exactly how package Chris made in a fever dream, but of commits, but
Okay.
sort of
Yeah.
sort
I
of
mean,
why.
I could see
Yeah.
how that would work. Sure.
It
How about your
is.
version?
Well, yeah. I mean, I would say I would. I think I said this on the episode with Caleb, but I'll say it again. It's like both the reason that WordPress is so popular and also the reason why everyone hates programming WordPress plugins and themes, right?
Sure. Okay.
Because on one hand, the hook system in WordPress provides so much power and flexibility that plugin developers can really augment the platform to do whatever they can imagine, right? Because no matter how, I mean, we all like to think, oh, if I provide the right interfaces and extension points and like, break all my code out into really nice isolated classes that have their own, like, each have their own interface, like somehow I can make my code perfectly extensible. But like, you can never imagine all the scenarios that someone's going to need. Whereas like kind of the beauty of the WordPress hook system is just like, we just give you spots to execute code and you do whatever the heck you want. We pass some things in, you can pass some things out, and like, we have no idea what you're going to do with it. And so hooks, it's a GLHD/hooks if you want to check it out. Essentially is a package that lets you expose that functionality in your code, right? So hooks is not so much meant for userland code as it is for either like package level code or places in your application that need sort of extreme flexibility. And so it kind of comes in two parts. The first is closer to what Caleb and I talked about, where essentially you just drop a trait onto any class, right? And then inside that class, you can make calls to like this call hook, and you pass it a name, and you pass it any number of variables. And that becomes an extension point in your class, right? So like the example that I've used is, you might have like a request somewhere in the request response lifecycle. You want to let people like hook in at the request side and then hook in at the response side. So like you would expose a call hook right before you pass the request through your application, and then you would add a call hook after you receive the response that you're going to return to the user. And now you have these like 2 points in time that like are extensible. And then on the flip side, a consumer of that API would call like router : hook, and that gives them back an object that lets them call each of those extension points. And the reason that it's sort of, it gives you this object that covers all the hooks inside of a given class is this is something I would have never thought of, but Caleb pointed out a lot of times you need to like orchestrate things between different hook points. So for example, like in that request response lifecycle stuff, a really good example would be like request timing. And with request timing, you want to like grab the timestamp that the request came in, and then, calculate the difference between the timestamp and when the response went out. So you need the original value too. So being able to kind of define all of your hook calls together for a given class gives you the opportunity to kind of orchestrate between them in an interesting way. And it handles, there's also some stuff around just like needing to handle data into the hooks and data back out of the hooks that I won't get into. But the thing that I realized was that same concept is kind of perfect for this view problem, because now in your view, you can just put like X hook, give it a name, and pass it as many properties as you want. And in your application, all you do is view : hook. You pass the view name as the first argument. And thanks to the incredible Laravel idea, you get view name autocomplete on that call for free. And then you just pass it the name of the hook that you're hooking into and a closure. And now you can hook into that point in time. And if you don't pass it a closure, you can just pass it a view, and that will render that view in that location. Or you can actually pass it anything that implements the HTML interface. And so the reason that feels like such a good solution to this email problem is kind of going back to the original requirements. In our case, we know that, kind of going back to it's North Carolina, right? That has the blackout dates.
Yeah, North Carolina.
Going back to this North Carolina situation, North Carolina has a requirement that no one can take courses for continuing education during these blackout periods. And we need to present that in, if someone's in the middle of a course, we may need to present that to them like, oh, you started the course, but like you need to stop until the blackout period's over. Or if someone's trying to start a course, we need to present it to them. Or if we're sending someone like a email about a course reminder, we may need to check, like, normally we would send out a reminder now, but is this person licensed in North Carolina? Maybe we need to hold back. Like, there's a bunch of different places where that logic, that same single piece of logic, impacts different parts of the app. And so being able to essentially have a single class that holds all of the North Carolina licensing logic, that basically makes the call once, like does this blackout date stuff apply to the active user? And if so, it can hook into the email view, and it can hook into the reminder logic, and it can hook into the like course start view, and like it can hook into all of those places. That's like the power of this like inversion of control. Like you've sort of rescinded control of these points and said like someone else is going to know better what to do here, and now we have this nice really really focused class that only has to do the logic once. We can coordinate that with like a parent object that runs the logic for all these different licensing bodies, so to the degree that any of that logic is shared, you can handle that in the parent, and you're not having to do extra data loading. So it's like it is really powerful, I think, and I think it's great for this circumstance, and I think it's potentially going to play out to be a really good way to handle these scenarios where you just don't know. You know that this is going to need to be changed, but the number of different ways that it could go is just too hard to reason about. You kind of need to break it up into rational chunks. It's all theoretical right now. We haven't actually implemented it. So,
Sure.
we may do another episode in a month being like, well, we were wrong about that.
I mean, I will say too that like the way that this was solved originally in the code that's still running today is massive numbers of if statements in 1,000-line files, and it works, but it's very hard to reason about. And so, we we've experienced the pain of what this is and are trying to figure out what a different solution is. And so,
right.
it's if statements worked for many, many years, but time to
Absolutely.
try something different.
Yeah.
So I don't know that I would be like, let's use hooks in my weekend project. I mean, maybe, but it might just be more confusing.
Right. No, I think that's kind of the thing that I keep on coming back to is like, this is not the right solution for most people, right? Don't jump to using hooks because it's like, it's adding a layer of complexity that you probably don't need unless you're dealing with these like really, really large scale conditional situations, or you're building something that like, if you're building something that should support plugins, I think it's a great option, and you should check it out for sure, But
Totally.
sorry, Bogdan, I cut you off.
No. So I have two questions. One, in this example of kind of pre-computing this North Carolina data for the view, maybe the mailable or wherever the thing is, like where would that code be called, right? Is it like in the app service provider or somewhere, or like in a controller it gets computed for all of those, like their macros, I'm assuming, right? And all these, logic trees or whatever they are basically right there and then computed, or it just gets passed to that view or whatever else and then it gets called, and that's where the computation actually happens.
Yeah, I mean,
does that make sense?
yeah, no, it totally does. I mean, I think we may be getting in the weeds a little bit, but I'm
Sure.
happy to go there. That's kind of the point. So I think that the approach that I imagine is that you would have like a singleton orchestration object of some sort, like a registry of all of the different like extenders or whatever you want to call them. And that singleton object is going to be something that like internally memoizes what has been called and whether things have been called or not, like what its current state is. And like you'd need a way to reset it, because like in a lot of cases it's going to be just like one user inside of a request lifecycle, and you don't have to worry about it. But if you're like looping over 1,000 users, you need to be able to reset that state between each user, or like 1,000 circumstances. Like there needs to be some function where you can kind of just like wipe that slate clean. But in general, I would imagine, you have this like single object that internally knows what's been run, And so then in your controller, you just like load that object out of the container and just call like a method that's like, make sure that everything has been run, either run it now, or like if it's already been run, then you're good to go. Some sort of just like register hooks method, right? And if the hooks have already been registered, then that's just a no op. If they haven't, it registers all the hooks. But essentially, yeah, that's kind of my idea, is as close to the point where you're going to need one, you would just call that. And that way you're not like executing all this logic all the time. You're only executing it if you need it, right? And yeah, it's going to be, I think caching or memoizing in different ways, like the logic of which hooks need to be registered for any given user or any given scenario, like the trade-off there is going to be tricky because it is really dynamic, but it's also very complex because, like I said, there are just so many different licensing bodies and any given user can be in one of many different circumstances. So like that's going to be a challenge for us to solve, but I think that's generally a good pattern for this type of approach that feels right, where you're just like, you kind of have one parent object that's responsible for initializing all of the objects that actually register the hooks, and that way each sort of child object is responsible for just doing its own logic, but you still just have like one thing to interact with.
I see. Okay, that makes sense. And I guess one other question about hooks, and that's all I got for you, Chris. All the positive things that you've said about WordPress and the negative things about WordPress hooks, like what is the likelihood of getting into that same trap that WordPress kind of has, where you can install, say, a package and it's also using hooks, and maybe it's injecting something into your template that now you don't want, and like, do you want somebody to just say like, yeah, oh, you're using hooks for your footer, let me just put something into that footer? Like, could there be a situation like that where then you're like scratching your head how to disable some sort of automatic script loading or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think on one hand, that is just a fundamental problem with like a pluggable system, right? If you're installing a plugin that executes within your application, like you're just taking on some risk, or you're taking on like the choices that the author of that plugin made, right? And if you don't like the choices that they made, like you either have to, try to get them to change it, or find something else, or fork it, or whatever. So, I think you're right that extensible systems just have that problem. I think, from my perspective, the thing that makes WordPress hooks so awful to work with is that is the primary interface for everything. I don't
Whether this
think,
is just like sugarcoating some stuff
well,
within
I
your
just think
application.
there are places where using a hook feels appropriate, and there are other places where it doesn't. And I think for a bunch of probably perfectly reasonable reasons, WordPress kind of went down this path of everything is a hook, and every time we need a new extension point, we add new hooks because this is the way things are done. But I don't think that would be how you'd build an application like that today. I think you probably would still want to have those same types of extension points. I think like this hooks concept is really great. And, like, we're probably going to add it to verbs. We're probably going to use it in our app. Like, I think it's a good idea, but I don't think it's the right way to extend everywhere. Right. And just like in Laravel, like in Laravel, you could like, you could say, okay, if you want to add the IP address of the requesting user to the payload of any job that gets queued, right? and a reasonable thing would be, okay, well, just write your own Q driver. You can extend the WordPress one and just override the method that generates the payload and call the parent generate payload and then just augment that. And that's a fine approach, but it's not a good approach. Like Laravel decided to like expose a create payloads using helper function exactly because like you want to do that often and you don't want to have to like own your own Q driver just so that you can add a little bit of data to the Q payload, right? And so I think hooks is exactly that. It's like lots of times just registering a different implementation of a specific class or just passing a closure somewhere, or there's a lot of other ways to extend code that are often better. And so you would just use hooks in the places where it really made sense. Like that would be my take.
Yeah, that sounds like a compelling, mechanism to hook into your system.
There you go.
Yes.
So the question is, if we go back to the very beginning, like, are we ever gonna put some eloquent driven conditionals inside of a should render moving forward?
Depends when you're on vacation.
Oh no.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we should do is, we just put a hook call in there, and we just dispatch this hook thing and have should render, call that hook function, and whatever
There you
wants to render it
go.
or doesn't want to render it, we can just
The worst of both worlds. That's Bogdan's approach.
Can
yes.
we, even better, can we add a hook and then register an event dispatcher inside the hook so that you can listen for that event and trigger something that then triggers the hook to trigger the should render to return false?
I
Think
love
about
it. It's
Absolutely.
certainly over engineered. I'll say that.
Oh man.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
that
honestly
was a
don't
fun
know.
one.
Yeah, I honestly don't know if there is a concrete answer. I feel like all of these things have their pluses and minuses, and maintenance cost, and just life cycle stuff. So I don't know. It's a really challenging, hard yes or no.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know, Skylar, do you think you're going to be
I
using this pattern
mean,
in your own stuff now?
I think I don't know. I my code writing outside of work hours is like, close to zero because I have a 2-year-old who is like,
Sure.
"Dad, stop being on the computer." But I I I figure like should render is in the framework. Like at some point Taylor merged it. So I mean it's not documented, but I like should render over some if statements, and I definitely think in any work that I'm doing that's not editor natchy, like it's just probably not big enough to warrant using hooks.
Right.
It's like I'd probably still stick to should render, but my app has 0 users, so it doesn't matter.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, since we first had this conversation, I mean, I've definitely found myself leaning towards like Blade only components, but I was thinking like I merged in 2 Blade components that like at the root have an if statement since we had this initial conversation. So it's like clearly I have bought into this idea. I can't remember where they were, but I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I think that like yeah, being able to just drop in a Blade component and know that it's going to do something if it needs to is great. It's just like how far down that path do you go?
Yeah. I think if it was a new project, if it's a new project, I think I would use should render. I recognize if you're in an existing project that has a format like introducing this new thing in one place that then you don't use anywhere else, like that can feel bad and confusing because you're like, I don't know where to look
Right.
for this.
That's fundamentally what it comes down to, is like you have to pick your conventions and stick with them, even if sometimes you bump into something where it's like, well, arguably this could be a little better doing it a slightly different way, but it's like, is it better enough to force people to have to figure out like the difference this one time? Probably not, unless it really is, and then you do it, right? Like that's definitely a piece of it as well.
Or Chris just goes away for a weekend and comes back with a, hey guys, check this out. Let me show you this package that I wrote at 2 a.m.
I showed Skyler. I was like, I call him up on Tuple and I'm like, what do you think of this as a solution to this problem? And he just like is quiet for 15 seconds. And then it's just like, your brain works a totally different way than mine does.
Yes. Welcome to the club, Skyler.
Think so differently. And like you called me up, I don't know, it was Tuple, it was like 10 a.m. on a Monday. I was just like, what is happening? I haven't even finished my coffee yet. You're just dropping hooks.
I was so jazzed. It was
cool. I was still also in defensive mode because we were still going back and forth about my PR. So I was like,
that's fair.
I don't know. But I do think hooks will be better for us in this context.
Nice. Well, is there anything else that we want to touch on before we call it, or any non view hook related stuff that's on your mind before we call it a day?
No, I think we've covered everything.
All right, we'll see how this whole video thing goes. Maybe there'll be I'll selectively clip some bits that make me look really good and post them on Twitter, and it'll be great. You'll love it.
Perfect. Great. Well, Bogdan, maybe you should take the headphones off, put on your cowboy hat.
You got to put the hat on for the last minute. We told Bogdan that he needed to bring his cowboy hat, and he actually showed up with it, but then he couldn't use the headphones. So
yeah, unfortunately, they don't make cowboy headphones compatible. So
I bet you they do. Actually, I bet you somewhere
they're probably called AirPods.
Right.
Yes. Let's over-engineer headphones for
those 10-gallon hats, though. That some of the Westerns have.
I still think that I bet you somebody has made like over-the-ear headphones that work with a cowboy hat, because like it's just got that has to exist in the world, right?
Yeah,
Enough,
I mean it must
country
because
music stars.
Yeah, I mean it must, because you go to Texas, which is where I got this hat, and like every other person has a cowboy hat, and you think to yourself like, how do they wear like the big headphones? Like there must be a solution. Someone's out there just missing either on a lot of money or is already super rich from this idea.
There you go. Well, if it doesn't exist, now we know what the next side hustle is.
Yes. All right, guys.
All right. Well, until next time.
Yep.
Video, everyone gets to watch us wait for the outro music. All right.
When do you cut it?
Oh no.
Yeah.
I said see ya and then you were talking.